You're very welcome back. Well, Green Party today, Neasa Hourigan still here with me, and I'm also joined now by aviation journalist Eoghan Corry from travelextra.ie, because we're going to debate an EU plan to remove the tax exemption on aviation fuel. Airlines currently do not pay tax on jet fuel, but this is about to change under EU proposals. We ask, what will it all cost? So first of all, I suppose, Eoghan, to you, what is the justification for this exemption?
It's there for a long, long time. It's an international agreement, Chicago Convention, 1944. It was put in place to make sure that people weren't trying to pull fast ones in international aviation, that governments were trying to tax rival airlines out of it. And it's held its shape.
But I suppose what's the justification? It was agreed, I think, back in that Chicago Convention that was back in the 1940s. We know a lot more now about the damage being done to the environment because of fuel, including jet fuel. So what is the justification for continuing with an exemption?
It's the same as the reason it was introduced. There's a safety element. It makes sure that airlines are paying the same for jet fuel all over the world, wherever they land, wherever they take off. Governments have been, since 1944, looking at ways to shake down aviation, to try and tax them, to try and push rival airlines out. There's a lot of politicking. There were lots of attempts down the years to try and introduce, and everybody who's looked at it has backed away and said it's unraveling this is going to be a little bit more complicated than we anticipated.
Do you accept that, Neasa, that this is going to be too complicated to do?
No, I mean, we've just seen a corporation tax, a global corporation tax minimum introduced. And if we could get to an agreement on that, we can definitely do it on aviation fuel. The Chicago Convention that we're talking about here has been significantly revised 8 times in its lifespan. And it also has about 19 annexes, which are constantly under revision. So it is possible to bring agreement. I think what's interesting here is the idea that the EU would show leadership, because you can see the EU starting to do that with things. They're almost creating like a carbon boundary around the EU. And so actually, I think if the EU moved on it and created within the single market some kind of a tax on this, I think actually it would show leadership. And in the same way that, let's say, when the US and the EU came to agreement on the corporation tax, we saw that. I think it will happen. And I think it will happen because the whole idea of the environment is costing governments so much, and most of our taxes on the environment are based on 2 principles. One is the polluter pays. The person who creates the pollution, or the group or the organisation that creates the pollution, should pay for that pollution, not the farmer down in Munster, not the guy in Cork who's been flooded 3 or 4 times, the actual polluter. And then the second one is that consumption taxes are fairer, that if we know what people are using, then we have an actual mechanism to tax them fairly, so those people who can't pay won't, and those who can do.
So it has been unfair, therefore, that the polluter, the airline industries here, haven't been paying, Eoghan Corry, when so many of us have.
Well, it's the same principle applies. Airlines pay the same for jet fuel wherever they load and they land and take off in the world. They're not going to be shopping around. They're not going to be skipping out of airspace, in and out of airspace. The reality is that everybody who's looked at this, and governments in Africa and Asia and all of this have been looking to try and tax this, they've gone after the airline ticket. 33% of what you pay in an airline ticket goes in tax. In a lot of the transatlantic flights, sometimes the tax is higher than what the airline gets. So while they haven't had the power to tax fuel, taxing aviation has been something that's been rigorously done around the world, including within the EU.
Okay, so you're saying aviation has already been taxed quite vigorously. Would you agree with that?
In the same way that, like, we pay motor tax and then we also pay fuel in our car, we should be paying aviation taxes in lots of forms, but also aviation fuel tax. And let's not get it confused here. The aviation industry is undergoing incredible profits at the moment. I think Ryanair made something like a 60% increase in their profits, and certainly almost twice what they were making in 2019. Like, it is an incredibly profitable industry. We could raise taxes through aviation fuel, and there would be absolutely no reason for the industry to raise ticket prices if they chose not to.
Yeah, and haven't the CSO argued that this exemption has been worth about €5 billion to the industry over the last decade? They've done very well under this, Eoghan Corry.
I'm not sure they have. The aviation industry has lost a hell of a lot of money. You talk about Ryanair's profits. They took a hit of $2 billion during the pandemic. It's interesting.
They made $2 billion last year.
And they didn't make $2 billion last year, but they're still chasing the hit they made over the pandemic. But back to Ciara's question here, there are lots of ways of getting money, of taxing the airline ticket without going after that key jet fuel.
But why? Because if I go to fill up my tank with petrol or diesel as the consumer of that fossil fuel, I pay a specific tax on that. Why does the airline, when they go to fill up with their jet fuel, get away with not paying a tax on their fossil fuel?
Apples and oranges.
In what way?
You're not subject to an international agreement. You're not an industry that brings 1.3 trillion of foreign direct investment into Ireland. If anybody is involved in propping up the economy or bringing that boost to the economy, they're doing deals with revenue commissioners. It's not within the EU's remit. They can start taxing the EU airlines. But then we have this uneven playing field that the whole point of the Chicago Convention, very simple, was to avoid exactly what the EU are proposing doing. And the EU have the power. They have actually decided in 2003 that domestic flights can be taxed. It's very interesting. That would apply to the Kerry and Donegal flights, which are being subsidised in Ireland. And one country did that and then changed their mind. It's the same country that the EU Climate Commissioner comes from that is making this proposal at the moment.
Isn't there a difficulty here, Neasa, that if the EU introduce this tax, that those airline industries, they'll just pass it on to the consumers, that the customers' price that they pay for the tickets will just go up?
Do I think that the aviation industry is capable of profiteering off any increase? Absolutely, I do. But ultimately
will the customer pay more?
There is absolutely no need for the customers to pay more.
In the reality,
the reality is that 4% of emissions in the EU are created by the aviation industry. And Michael O'Leary isn't going to come down and pay for the flood defences down in Cork. Michael O'Leary is not going to pay for all of the impacts that ordinary people are going to experience from climate. The polluter should pay, and that's the aviation industry.
Yeah. And it is true, isn't it? I think it's 3.8% of all greenhouse gas emissions within the EU come from the aviation industry. The polluter is not paying for that.
Yeah, there's loads of figures floating around. 2% is what the emissions are from the aviation industry worldwide. You would actually think it was 82%, the way aviation is being held up and targeted as the chief polluter. The first thing that would happen... I don't think
anybody in fairness has said it's the chief polluter. They're just saying there should be fairness across the board.
It's interesting, like, if you quantify the coverage of climate emissions, it tends to come back to aviation. It's been surveyed that this is what shows up in national media. What would happen if it happened in Ireland is that most of our air traffic would move to Belfast. We'd have 30 million going through Belfast, 5 million through Dublin every year, instead of the other way around. That's exactly what would happen.
OK, look, we're going to have to leave that conversation there for now. My thanks to Eoghan Corry and to Neasa Hourigan. That's it from us. Our programme is available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. But from the Late Team here, good night. Take care.